So welcome back to those joining us online this afternoon for our Q&A session with our three speakers, Mr. Brian Caulfield, Professor Joe O'Hara and Mrs. Assumpta O'Neill. We'll take the questions from the floor in no particular order. So we have one question from 10 and then 4. So question table 10, 4, then 2. If you could just introduce your name, if possible, just stand up and announce your question. Thank you.
Hi, I'm Peter from Donamead from Table 10. I'm just wondering, in terms of acquiring land for transport or education or other purposes, would you support a DEM being able to CPO land or other assets? Thanks. Sorry, this is to all three of you. Thank you.
I could start off with transport. Currently, the local authorities, or currently the NTA, do have that power to CPO land, and there's a lot of that happening with bus connects. So as part of those bigger projects, if the mayor, the DM was in charge of it, then yes, that will be something that would happen. But I think with more consensus and dialogue, as I said in my presentation, is very important. That's something that the NTA have been quite good at, I think.
From an education perspective, I think CPO is a bit dramatic at one end of the thing. I think engaging in dialogue, conversation, and thinking about the way you can use space in education, educational space is the way we need to start with that. Because as I said in the presentation, the capacity to use educational infrastructure and to connect it to other social service infrastructure is something that's very underdone here. So I think we definitely need to think of the way that we use space and the way that we plan for space within education. So I would encourage that. I don't know enough about the CPO process to make a comment, but it does strike me as being the outside edge of how you might do something.
And I think, yeah, in relation to childcare, I think, you know, it's very much a case of looking about what's needed within an area. And I think there could be an awful lot more cooperation and collaboration, even with education facilities as well, you know, where you would have, you know, community hubs, family hubs, where you'd have everything together, you know. So I think it is about actually having a lot more dialogue about, and it's very much about meeting the need, whatever the need may be in the particular area.
Okay, thank you very much for that answer. So I've already obviously had a thought-provoking presentations. We've got 9 questions, a limited amount of time. Maybe if you just, when the question is posed, whoever might be the relevant speaker might just respond. But if you believe you have a point to make, please do so. We've got 4, 8, 2 and 5, then 6, 9, 6. Okay, so Malcolm, table 4.
Within your 3 specific areas, what powers would you suggest would be appropriate to devolve to any DEM? Don't be rushing now.
I can go first, but the power is already with the local authorities. It is around the public realm and making decisions upon that. I think that's one of the key things, and also bringing in the analysis of changing the use of land space in the public realm, that we bring in climate and we also bring in air quality and well-being as part of the changeover. And again, with consultation and dialogue, I think that will be important. It's worked very well in Paris.
I think in relation to childcare, I think it's very much, it's not even about giving the power, but it's actually about implementing the national policy locally. But what you need to do is that you need to obviously collaborate and consult with the DM, because I think that that's very important, because it's about looking about what the specific need is and how you actually implement the national policy locally.
It's a really hard question. I think I think we need to step back one level and think, what do we think a directly elected mayor can do? I mean, it's not what you transfer to them, it's what role do you think that they should have within education, because education is so vast. But my own hobby horses, I'd give them control of quality assurance and give them an opportunity to think about how we do things at a local level in education that benefits the local community. I'd give them some engagement in curriculum development to make sure that the curricula are focused in areas that benefit a Dublin region and possibly connect to a skills agenda as well. And I'd give them some sort of integrative or some sort of coordination area across the different aspects of planning, infrastructure and other provision to make sure that we maximise the impact of what we spend in the area of education. So they'd be 3 things.
Thanks, table 4, Malcolm. Do we have a question from table 8, or did I get my hands mixed up? No. Okay, move on to table 2, 5, 6, 9 and 6. Table 2, please.
Hello, I'm Shane from Table 2. So one of the things that struck us from the different presentations was the plethora and fragmentation of various agencies in each of the areas. How best do you think in each area the mayor should interact with those agencies, or would reform of the overall structure and shape of those agencies be necessary for them to be effective?
Again, I can start with transport. I think that the agencies that are currently there in terms of the NTA and TII and the department, I think that it works quite well. Perhaps there might be a specific Dublin office or Dublin office within maybe those agencies, or that there's more dialogue between the two of them. I wouldn't be in favour of bringing a lot of power over from the NTA into a mayor's office, mainly because of skills shortages and duplication, but also the fact that the NTA, you know, the Dublin transport is the lion's share of transport in the country, and that's what they're currently managing.
And I think in relation to childcare, yes, I think, you know, the issue at the minute is you have 4 local authorities and you have 4 county childcare committees, and then you also have a Department of Children. So that's 17 different agencies involved at the minute, if you look at it that way. So hopefully if there was a national childcare agency, and then what you would have is you would have a local Dublin office, and then they could liaise with the mayor's office, and it would streamline things a lot more. And I think obviously then hopefully what should happen is that things would be implemented quicker.
And in education, I think, yeah, it's an alphabet soup. I mean, there's so many different agencies. I think 2 things, and you have to think about how you would set up a directly elected mayor. If there is, and it's a continuum from advisory and consultative, where you create some sort of mayoral forum in education where they can try and bring people together and get them talking together, which is a good early stage, all the way through to legislative and policy and legal responsibility in specific areas. But Assumpta just pointed to a fact there. Most of our agencies are national. So when you've got national agencies in psychological services or whatever, how is a locally elected mayor going to interact with the national ones? And are you going to create another layer of agencies to interact with? So there's a lot to think about in that way, and a lot of careful thought. But I would just start, as our speaker said before, Tim said, I would just start and do something and start coordinating now and then see what emerges.
Thank you. Table 5, 6, 9 and 6. Table 5, please.
Yes, just in relation to the current structure with the ETBs around the country, the councillors would make up the democratic majority on the board out in Dublin, which I'm involved in, Dublin City ETB. We have 12 of the 23 members. Is there a role for a correspondence structure in the primary sector? And I'm mindful of the fact currently the City Council and our CEO only recently just made the comment that we're involved in lots of stuff that we're not mandated, and I'm talking about the provision of childcare buildings in the city. Many of the buildings I know in Ballyfermot and Cherry Orchard that I represent have been paid for and funded by the City Council, and it's not their mandate to provide them, but they've provided them because nobody else was going to do it. So I'm just saying, moving forward, is there a role there for a similar structure, as I say, of the current CDETB in Dublin? I'll use an example, and the correspondent with Dublin Dunleary in the county, for a primary similar. Now I know we're developing community national schools, but that'll take many, many years to roll out, and we've none at the moment in the city other than 2 in hospitals. But is there a role there? That's what I'm saying. And obviously the democratically elected mayor would have an involvement in that, and I still believe they should have an involvement in the ETB. And you've mentioned there, Professor O'Hara, in particular in relation to curriculum development and skills that are needed in specific parts of the city and country. Thanks.
Well, yes. Sorry, I don't mean to make that. That's not being facetious. Yes, there should be, but it's an extraordinarily complex and complicated area because of the way our education system has developed since the 1830s. So we do have an education system that is largely privately owned in primary school and centrally funded, and then controlled through legislation. So I think yes, in any democratic polity, there should be a way in which those who are elected and those who represent people who are elected, who represent people, should have a functional role in the management and organisation of education. I think that's a given. But how you get from where we are now to where you're talking about being, that's going to take a long, long time. But again, in my presentation, I tried to suggest, well, maybe we just start by, could we have voluntary coordination of people talking to each other who are in the roles in primary school as patron or community representatives, where the mayor would have a role in that. And again, start simply, and then take on the thorny issue of who owns education in Ireland. And none of us here will be alive when that conversation is finished. So that's.
Thank you. Table 6, 9, and then back to 6. Thank you.
Hi, Michael from Table 9. 6, whoops, sorry. Upside down. Dublin bus goes to Meath, the Dart goes to Wicklow, and there's a bike lane that goes from Dublin into Kildare. So if there's a Dublin mayor and they've control over Dublin transport, would they also control some transport in the wider region? And I know you were saying maybe not to pass those powers on, but I'm wondering, how do other cities deal with that? Because obviously lots of people commute into London, but they're not living in London, but the Mayor of London has a lot of transport powers. So how do other cities do that, if you know?
And the Lewis is going to go to Bray, so there's another example of a mode. In London, the services that are run by TfL, yes, they go outside of the region, and they're operated by TfL, Transport for London, as they leave the region. And something similar could happen in Dublin if there was a Dublin Transport Office, that these services would go into Wicklow, Kildare, wherever, and they would just be operated that way, and that would have the regional aspect that I mentioned. And there are other examples across the world that this happens in, where directly elected mayors operate, or the operation of these transport modes are in other places outside of their jurisdiction. But there's lots of examples of it.
Thank you. Table 9, and then I think back to 6, but we'll go with table 9 first.
Hi, Madeline here from Table 9. This is for Assumpta. What is the current structure of collaboration between the childcare committees and local authority staff and elected members, councillors? As a councillor for 6 years in South Dublin County Council, I'd never heard of the childcare committees until today, which makes me wonder what the relationship and the structure is currently, and how can that structure be improved with a directly elected mayor?
Gosh, yeah. What do I say to that? Yeah, I think, as I said in my presentation, it varies from county to county. It does. I mean, we would have a very close working relationship in Wicklow with the county council, particularly the planning department. So I think that that's the problem, because we are 30 limited companies. There isn't enough consistency. So I think that that's why when they were looking at the review of the structures in relation to childcare, it was very much about how do we get more consistency. So I think by setting up a national agency, then I would think the way it will have to go is that there'd have to be a local office, that then hopefully that there will be more collaboration. But yeah, I think maybe there is a role there for county childcare committees too, that, we do need to ensure that, people know what we do and what we're about, and that we are the local agent of the Department of Children. So I think, until the new agency comes into place, there is a role for us, to do that. So I will certainly take that back to my colleagues.
Thank you. We're at 16:30. We've got 5 minutes left. I have 10 minutes of a wash-up at the end, but essentially I'll be saying I'm just really impressed with the engagement from you this afternoon, the Members' Assembly, and how inspired myself and Art are, and the rest of the crew to be with you this afternoon, that you commit your time to it, to this really important matter. So that's really my conclusion. So we're going to use that time productively, rather than hear me talking. And do we have another question on table 6? Or we do, yeah. So it's Paul, then it is to John in table 12, then it was back to Luke, and then it's to table 11. That's where we finished. So it's 6, 12, 1, 11.
Yeah, my question may change your view there that you've just expressed, Jim. So Tim O'Connor's presentation, where he was saying he's a convert to the idea of local government and delegating more and more authority and influence, etc., to the local level. And of course, our mandate is, that we will have a democratically elected mayor. It's just the detail around that. So, but should we not start from the point that we should try and delegate as much as possible? If some isn't possible to delegate, that's a different thing. But at least conceptually, we should start from that platform. And then specifically as it relates to transport, because I think you said in your presentation at one point that we should be very careful how we insert a democratically elected mayor into the current transport arrangements and agencies and whatever. And then you've also mentioned this point about duplication and skilled staff. But of course, it's not about duplication, and the skilled staff can stay in place. It's just a question of who is actually directing all of that and who's responsible for all of that. So it's just, I just, again, this is to you, Brian, particularly, that you seem to have this mindset that what we have in place now, your concern seems to be that if you throw a democratically elected mayor into that mix, that somehow or other we're going to have chaos. But if that is the case, or if that you know, then why are we all here? You know, change is always challenging. That's just the nature of life for all of us. So yeah, I'm just curious that you seem to have a sort of a, you know, an overly cautious view on how a democratically elected mayor would be involved in the transport of the city, which is obviously a very key part of running any city is transport. And as somebody said earlier from some table, in other cities we see that the mayor does have that authority. So yeah.
I suppose I'll start off about the point that the other cities that we're using as frames of reference have these huge transport networks. Maybe if I took look at it from two different perspectives, I think the delivery of infrastructure that's really badly needed, and the metros and light rail and all the rest, I think that's the side of the house that I don't think a directly elected mayor, I think, would just add more air into the area that's currently there, and mainly because we've only got 10 years to deliver most of this transport infrastructure that's required, and I would be worried that there could be delay. But as I said also in my presentation, if it was devolved to the mayor, it would be the volume of money that will be required and funding that will be required to deliver these massive transport infrastructure projects. In terms of the other stuff, I suppose the day-to-day running of transport, you're right, you know, a minister versus a directly elected mayor in terms of regulation of public transport, they're both directly elected officials. The NTA could be reporting to the mayor as easily to the Minister for Transport. I don't really see the point in it, but you know, if there was a policy platform that was there that would convince me, then yes, perhaps. But a lot of the power that runs transport in our cities around road space and around traffic management and around parking, that's already at the local authority level. I think that can be done an awful lot better than it's currently being done, and I think a directly elected mayor, as I said in my presentation, with a mandate could push change forward in that. So I think there's two sides of the house: the infrastructure problem, the infrastructure deficit that we have in our city compared to the day-to-day running. The infrastructure deficit, I think that needs to stay with national government. It needs to be treated with kid gloves at the moment to get it across the line, because we've waited 20, 30 years for this to happen, and I'm not sure a directly elected mayor is going to expedite it.
Thanks, Brian. So we now move on to table 12, 1 and finally 11.
Hi, John from table 12. Two quick questions in one. Just on education, probably for Joe. The Department of Education and Skills currently plans all educational infrastructure, and I think it's fair to say in suburban areas it plans it quite badly. Would a directly elected mayor having a role in planning local education needs, schools, perhaps school places, special classes, would that be beneficial, and would it be helpful? Is that the sort of thing that could be devolved? And secondly, more on public transport. I think, Brian, you're quite clear. I think that you think the NTA and the other major agencies should retain a key role in delivering key infrastructural projects. But should a directly elected mayor have the ability to influence their activity or influence their programme of work for national agencies like the NTA or TII? And if so, how would that work? Thanks.
So quickly, John, yes, I think they should. I think they could influence in a very positive way the placing and the type of educational infrastructure that we have. I think it should be done in a consultative way as well, which may be something of a challenge. So I think some sort of structure would need to be set up to allow local communities and anybody with an interest in education in a specific area feeding into this. But I do think that there is a specific role for the directly elected mayor in citing educational infrastructure, yes.
On public transport, yes, of course, the directly elected mayor would have the power and the mandate of the city behind them, so they definitely should be included. And I think the point I'm trying to make is that the volume of infrastructure that's required to be constructed has been a political football in this city for about 50 years, and a directly elected mayor that's on a different political cycle to the government could push transport projects around. I've been quoted in the press a number of times saying that I think we need a sláinte for transport, we need to put the plan in place in Dublin, we need all political parties to support it, and that we just expedite and make this thing happen. And I think we should make sláinte happen too, obviously, but that's what I think we should do in the city.
Thank you. Now table 1 with Luke, and finally table 11. Thank you.
It's a bit of a similar question because we wanted to ask something similar about transport, but maybe we should elect Robbie Keane so we could score that political football, you know. Our question is more about project planning, design and implementation. That would it make sense in your mind between national agencies and, say, local agencies that large projects can get moved in the planning implementation end of things, and agencies then act more as a regulatory or consulting capacity. And I suppose that can apply maybe to education as well, and childcare. Or is there value in that? And what does the current situation look like in that regard?
So in terms of the planning for transport, that is done by the NTA. They have a very large transport model that plans what modes of transport should be at different parts of the country. The whole country is modelled there. There's a very skilled team then within TII that deliver transportation infrastructure. But say when the Lewis Cross City was being built, you know, it wasn't TII and the NTA that pushed that across the city. It was Dublin City Council that worked with them to make that happen. So, you know, that consultative process is already in place. I just think that these big mega transport projects, you know, they should be in the realm of at a national level. I don't think if we had a directly elected mayor, we would ask them to build Art na Crusha. So, you know, it's that level that we're looking at in terms of the infrastructure that's required.
And I think similarly in relation to childcare, I think it's very much about having the national policy, but then looking about, you know, how do we ensure that the outcomes and the services that are needed within each particular area are actually delivered. And I think that that's where the role, you know, in relation to having a directly elected mayor could come in, because it's very much about looking about what is specifically needed for a particular area.
Yeah, and I completely agree with Assumpta for education as well. I think that's exactly the same thing with that too.
Thank you. And finally, table 11.
Jimmy from table 11. Brian, you've mentioned it a few times about the cost of infrastructural projects, and you did say that it would be essential that a directly elected mayor would have tax-raising capabilities. That probably wouldn't be enough for the kind of projects you're talking about, and might also be electoral suicide, I suppose, for him or her. So we're wondering what additional measures would you see? Would, for example, Dublin going solo on the international bond markets work, competing with Ireland on the same markets on a project-by-project basis?
If that were the case, that's what happened with the Cross City or the Elizabeth Line in London, that half of the funding came from the city, came from private investors, and it came from those types of models for that £14 billion sterling piece of infrastructure. And I think that will happen as well with the big ticket projects across the city. But as I said, it's 25 billion to deliver the Greater Dublin Area Transport Strategy. And I know in the next talk, and I think I can see the next speaker lining up in the corner. But in terms of the finance behind that 25 billion is a huge amount of money. But yeah, you're right. There are many different ways going to the public sector, going to the private sector to try and deliver these things a lot quicker.
Thanks, Brian, for that answer, and thanks, Jimmy, for that question from table 11, which dovetails nicely into our next presentation. But before we do that, I would just like to once again to our three presenters on devolution of powers that might be devolved, or powers that might be devolved. Mr. Brian Caulfield from Trinity College Dublin, Professor Joe O'Hara from Dublin City University, and Mrs. Assumpta O'Neill from Wicklow County Council Childcare Manager. Thank you so much on behalf of the Assembly for being with us this afternoon. Thank you.